You've been sleeping out for a month.
Not here.
You think I don't know?
Can you respect yourself for one moment?
If she's carrying something.
Power doesn't usually fail loudly. It fails quietly. Inside hospitals. Inside marriages. Inside systems designed to make violence look like coincidence. Kong Tae-min was untouchable. Feared. Protected. Certain that nothing, not betrayal, not truth, not consequences, could reach him. Until a pregnancy disappeared. Until medical records didn't match inventory logs. And until the only person who noticed the pattern was a black foreign auditor who refused to look away. This isn't a story about infidelity. It's a story about how power erases threats, legally, medically, silently. And what happens when someone finally proves it wasn't an accident. Because when a child is erased to protect an empire, someone has to decide whether the truth is worth burning everything down. This time, it was. Before we go any further, if you find my stories interesting, please hit that subscribe button. And drop your comment. Let's hear your thoughts. This one doesn't end where you think it does. And if you believe power should never be allowed to erase consequences, stay with me. Because what happens next is where everything spirals, and once you see how quiet this was, you won't unsee it. Power didn't shout here, it planned. And what happens next changes everything. The fluorescent lights in Seoul National University Hospital's private wing hummed like a held breath. I stood perfectly still as 6 armed security guards blocked both corridor exits, their hands resting on concealed weapons. Phones were already recording, staff, visitors, someone's trembling hand holding up an iPhone behind a potted palm. Everyone expected blood. Everyone expected chaos. Instead, I watched Kong Tae-min, the most feared man in Seoul's underworld, drop to his knees on polished hospital tile. His face had gone gray. Not the gray of fear, he'd never shown that in 17 years of running the Kong family, but the gray of something clinical, something spreading through his bloodstream faster than his men could process what they were seeing. 2 doctors rushed forward, shouting medical terms I recognized from another life. 30 seconds before cardiac arrest, the younger one yelled, reaching for Taemin's collar. I moved then. Not fast. Fast draws attention, triggers security responses, makes people think you're part of the threat. I walked with the steady precision of someone who'd spent 6 years working trauma units before I learned that healing the powerful sometimes means becoming complicit in their violence. My gloved hand, still wearing the black nitrile I'd put on 3 hours ago for reasons I still couldn't name, closed around the doctor's wrist before his fingers touched Taemin's skin. Don't move him, I said quietly. My voice cut through the noise like a scalpel through silk. You'll kill him faster. The corridor went silent. Every camera phone stayed raised, but nobody breathed. Taemin's eyes found mine, dark, calculating even now, trying to understand how a black woman he'd hired 6 months ago to audit his pharmaceutical distribution chain had just assumed command of his medical crisis in front of 40 witnesses. The monitors beside us showed his heartbeat climbing, erratic, dangerous. His second-in-command, Park Jin-ho, moved his hand toward his jacket. I looked at Jin-ho directly. If you reach for that weapon, the videos recording this will show you threatening medical personnel. The press arrives in 28 seconds. Your choice. Jin-ho's hand stopped. Taemin's lips moved. No sound came out, but I read the shape. How? I didn't answer. Instead, I knelt beside him, close enough that the cameras couldn't capture what I whispered. Stay down. Don't speak. When they ask what happened, you felt dizzy. Nothing more. His eyes held questions I had no intention of answering. Not here. Not with Seoul's entire criminal underworld watching through streaming video, waiting to see if the Kong Empire would crack in the most humiliating way possible, their boss on his knees, powerless, saved by someone nobody had considered important enough to eliminate when they should have. The press burst through the doors at exactly 30 seconds. But this didn't start here. 6 months earlier, I'd been standing in a different kind of corridor, the administrative wing of Myung Pharmaceuticals' Seoul headquarters, holding a report that should have destroyed my career before it saved anyone's life. The numbers didn't lie. Someone had been substituting lower-grade compounds in medication batches for 8 months. Not enough to kill immediately. Just enough to make treatments fail slowly, mysteriously, in ways that looked like disease progression rather than deliberate harm. My supervisor, an older Korean man who'd worked quality control for 30 years, had looked at my audit findings and said, Nia, sometimes the job is knowing what not to see. I stared at him. People are dying. People always die. This company employs 4,000 people in Seoul alone. You want to be the black woman who destroys many Korean families over some statistical anomalies? His voice was kind. Almost fatherly. That made it worse. I'm giving you a chance to be smart. Destroy the report. Accept the promotion we're offering. Everyone wins. I handed him my resignation that afternoon. No speech. No moral grandstanding. Just the knowledge that I couldn't look at myself if I traded lives for job security. My mother hadn't raised me to bow my head and call it wisdom. The money ran out 36 days later. My younger brother Terrence had gotten sick, the kind of sick that American insurance barely covered and Korean hospitals made you pay up front for. I'd burned through my savings in 2 weeks. Sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Called in every favor I had. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. I'd been sitting in my apartment, a shoebox in Itaewon that smelled like someone else's kimchi and my own exhaustion, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Miss Cole, the voice said in perfect English with a Seoul accent. My employer would like to discuss an opportunity. I'm not interested in opportunities that come from unlisted numbers, I'd replied. Even if it solves your brother's medical debt? Pause. We know you made the right choice at Myung Pharmaceutical. That choice has consequences. We'd like to help you manage them. I should have hung up. Instead, I'd heard myself say, where? The voice had given me an address. A luxury hotel in Gangnam. Neutral territory. I'd looked it up later, the kind of place where criminals and politicians conducted business under crystal chandeliers and called it civilization. The Shilla Hotel's tea lounge occupied the kind of space where silence cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd arrived exactly on time, wearing my only interview suit and the determined neutrality I'd perfected over 6 years of being the only black woman in rooms full of Korean executives who couldn't decide if I was incompetent or threatening. The man who'd called wasn't there. Instead, I watched a quiet negotiation happening 3 tables away, 4 men in expensive suits discussing something in voices too low to hear, their body language screaming territorial dispute. One of them kept glancing toward the entrance. Security theater. I recognized it because I'd spent enough time in hospitals to know when people were performing calm instead of feeling it. I was drinking overpriced tea and regretting every decision that led me here when one of the men stood up too fast. His chair scraped. His voice rose, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the ambient music. The Korean came too quickly for me to catch all of it, but the tone was universal. Someone had been disrespected, and honor demanded a response. The man nearest me pulled something from his jacket. Not a weapon. Documents. He spread them on the table with the deliberate care of someone revealing a winning hand. Whatever was on those papers made the standing man's face go pale. That's when I noticed it. The standing man's left hand was trembling. Not anger trembling. Medical trembling. Essential tremor, probably exacerbated by whatever medication he was taking for the heart condition I could diagnose from the slight cyanosis around his lips and the way he kept pressing his left arm against his ribs. The man with the documents leaned back, satisfied. He was going to let his opponent collapse. Right here. In public. On camera, because at least 2 phones were now recording from nearby tables. The humiliation would be total and permanent. I stood up. Walked to their table. All 4 men looked at me like I'd appeared from another dimension. Excuse me, I said in Korean, keeping my voice professionally pleasant. But that man needs to sit down before he passes out. The document man's eyes narrowed. This doesn't concern you. It will when he has a medical emergency and you're the last person seen provoking him. Security cameras are recording from 3 angles. You want that scrutiny? Silence. Then, from the corner where I hadn't noticed anyone watching, a voice spoke. Quiet. Male. Absolutely authoritative. She's right. Sit him down. The standing man sat. The trembling slowed. I met the eyes of the man who'd spoken, Kong Tae-min, though I didn't know his name yet, and saw calculations so precise it felt like being measured for a coffin. Your name, he said. Not a question. I picked up my tea, took a sip, and walked back to my table without answering. He'd followed me. Not physically, Kong Taemin didn't chase anyone. But 15 minutes later, as I was paying my bill, the server informed me it had been taken care of. The card left on the silver tray had only a phone number. No name. No explanation. I'd crumpled it into my pocket and left. Made it halfway through the hotel lobby before 3 men in dark suits formed a polite semicircle that wasn't quite blocking my path but definitely wasn't letting me pass without acknowledgement. Mr. Kong would appreciate a moment of your time, the center one said. His Korean was crisp, his deference absolute. These weren't bodyguards. They were the kind of men who made problems disappear before they became bodyguard-worthy. Taemin was waiting in a private room on the executive floor. No windows. One exit. A tea service that probably cost more than my rent. He gestured to the chair across from him, not asking, not demanding, just stating a fact about what would happen next. I sat. You corrected my negotiation, he said. I prevented a medical emergency. There's a difference. Is there? He poured tea with movements so economical they looked choreographed. You inserted yourself into a business that could have ended your life if you'd read the room incorrectly. That takes either courage or stupidity. Or medical training and basic human decency. His mouth almost smiled. Almost. Decency is expensive in my world. Most people can't afford it. Then maybe you're in the wrong world. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. His men shifted their weight. Taemin raised one hand, barely a movement, just the slightest adjustment of fingers, and they froze. I've had you investigated, he said, as casually as discussing weather. Nia Cole. American. I am 28 years old. 6 years in medical quality control. Recently unemployed because you refused to falsify audit findings at Myung Pharmaceutical. Brother with mounting medical debt. Bank account showing exactly $473. My jaw tightened. Then you know I can't be bought. Everyone can be bought. It's just a question of understanding the currency. He slid a folder across the table. I need someone to audit my pharmaceutical distribution network. Someone who can't be intimidated. Someone who sees problems other people ignore. Someone who doesn't belong near people like me. I opened the folder. Saw the salary figure. It would solve everything, Terrence's bills, my rent, the suffocating weight of trying to survive in a country where I'd always be foreign. Why me? Because you told the truth when lying would have been profitable. That's rare. Useful. Dangerous. His eyes held mine. And because you don't belong near people like me. Neither do you, I said quietly. This time, he smiled. It was terrifying. I'd taken the job with conditions that should have gotten me killed. No criminal activity. No falsifying results. Complete autonomy over my audits. The right to walk away at any time without consequences. Taemin had agreed to all of it. That should have been my first warning. The pharmaceutical operation was legitimate, barely. Everything operated in the gray space between legal and prosecutable, structured by lawyers who understood that intent mattered more than action in Korean courts. My job was simple, make sure nothing in the supply chain could be traced back to decisions Taemin made personally. I worked out of a small office in Gangnam, reviewing shipping manifests and quality reports, occasionally visiting warehouses where workers stopped talking when I entered. The first 2 months passed in an uncomfortable routine. I fixed my problems. I filed reports. Nobody died on my watch, which felt like the only moral victory I could claim. Taemin checked in weekly, always in public spaces, always surrounded by the kind of security that made civilians nervous. He asked pointed questions. Accepted my answers without argument. Never once asked me to compromise the boundaries I'd set. But boundaries are only as strong as the circumstances that respect them. The threat arrived on a Tuesday. Not a person. Not violence. Just a formal letter from Korea's Ministry of Food and Drug Safety informing me that my work visa application for renewal had been flagged for additional review. Timeline, indefinite. Implications, clear. Someone doesn't want you working here, my attorney said over the phone. The flag is political, not procedural. You need an advocate with government connections. I didn't have government connections. I had one phone number I'd been avoiding calling for exactly this reason. Taemin answered on the first ring. I'd been expecting this. You knew? I created the conditions that made it inevitable. You're effective, Nia. That makes people nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. I'm offering you protection. At what cost? Dependency. His voice carried something almost like regret. You'll owe me. Not money. Not loyalty. Just the understanding that sometimes, the right thing to do requires the wrong kinds of help. I'd closed my eyes. Felt the trap closing. I can leave Korea. Your brother can't. His treatment requires 6 more months minimum. You leave, he leaves. You know what happens then. I knew. I'd seen enough patients deteriorate when insurance ran out or families had to choose between treatment and survival. If I agree, I said slowly, my conditions don't change. I don't falsify anything. I don't cover up anything. I audit your operation honestly, or I don't do it at all. Agreed. Why would you accept that? Because, Taemin said quietly, having someone honest working for me is more valuable than having someone obedient. Even if it costs me everything. The visa flag disappeared within 24 hours. The difference between Kang Taemin in public and private became clear during my 3rd month. In meetings, he was controlled to the point of appearing mechanical, every word calculated, every gesture minimal, the kind of restraint that made grown men afraid to breathe wrong. He humiliated a lieutenant once for arriving 30 seconds late. Didn't shout. Didn't threaten. Just looked at him and said, "Your time is less valuable than mine. Remember that." The lieutenant had bowed so low his forehead almost touched the table. But in private, the rare moments when it was just him and me reviewing audit reports in his office after everyone else had left, something different emerged. Not warmth. Taemin didn't do warmth. But questions. Real ones. The kind that suggested he actually wanted answers instead of confirmation. Why did you really leave me young? He asked one evening, 3 months into my employment. You already know why. Your investigation was thorough. I know the facts. I'm asking why you chose principle over survival. He set down the report he'd been reading. Most people don't. Most people justify compromise until compromise becomes identity. I'd looked at him directly. My mother worked 2 jobs to put me through college. She cleaned houses for families who treated her like furniture. She never complained, never cut corners, never accepted less than what her labor was worth. My voice hardened. She died believing excellence would protect me. It doesn't. But that's all I have, that's mine. Taemin had studied me for a long time. Then he'd done something I'd never seen before, he laughed. Not loud. Not mocking. Just genuine surprise that someone had answered him honestly instead of strategically. You're wasted in quality control, he said. And you're wasted running a criminal empire. Probably. He'd returned to the report. But here we are. That conversation had ended. But something had shifted. He started asking for my opinion on matters beyond audits, personnel decisions, business risks, problems that had nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. I'd answer. Honestly. Sometimes brutally. He never flinched. I should have recognized it for what it was, the beginning of trust between 2 people who had no business trusting anyone. I didn't know about the affair. Nobody did, except the woman herself and whatever security Taemin trusted enough to keep it quiet. Her name was Han Min Seo, I learned that later, when everything exploded, and she worked in event planning for one of the Kang family's legitimate hotel properties. Beautiful, educated, from a good family. The kind of woman who could be seen in public with a man like Taemin without raising questions. The pregnancy was confirmed in late October. I know because I saw the change in Taemin's behavior before anyone else did. He became more controlled. More distant. The kind of distance that comes from protecting something too vulnerable to expose. What I didn't see was his wife noticing the same thing. Choi Soo-jin. That's her full name, though everyone called her Madam Choi in the carefully respectful way that acknowledged her position without presuming intimacy. I'd met her twice, brief, formal interactions where she'd looked through me rather than at me, the way powerful Korean women often looked at foreign employees. Not hostile. Just categorically unimportant. She was beautiful in the way of women who understood that beauty was a tool, not an identity. Mid-30s. Always perfectly presented. Smart enough to marry Taemin when his empire was still being built and patient enough to accept the role of public wife while he conducted his private life with the discretion that kept their arrangement functional. But patience has limits. And Soo-jin had been patient for 10 years. I didn't know any of this then. I was too busy managing my own survival, making sure my audit stayed clean, my brother's treatment stayed funded, and my conscience stayed mostly intact. I didn't have bandwidth for other people's marriages or affairs or the complex geometry of who owed whom in the Kong family hierarchy. I should have paid attention. Should have noticed when Soo-jin started asking questions about household staffing. Should have wondered why she personally interviewed housekeeping agencies when she had people whose job was exactly that. But I didn't notice. Not until it was far too late to stop what she'd already set in motion. Soo-jin smiled when she heard about the pregnancy. I know because Jin-ho told me later, trying to explain how he'd missed the warning signs. She'd been having tea with her mother-in-law when one of Taemin's cousins made an offhand comment, something about Min Seo looking radiant lately, glowing in that specific way that made older Korean women start counting months backward. Soo-jin had set down her teacup with perfect grace. How lovely, she'd said. Pregnancy suits her. Her mother-in-law had frozen. The cousin had gone pale. Everyone in the room understood immediately that Soo-jin knew, had probably known for weeks, and was choosing this moment to acknowledge it in the most publicly gracious way possible. She'll need help, Soo-jin continued, still smiling. The first trimester can be exhausting. Has anyone arranged household support? Nobody answered. Nobody knew what answer she wanted. I'll handle it, Soo-jin had said decisively. I know a very reputable agency. They specialize in discreet, professional care. I'll have them send someone suitable. She'd made the call that afternoon. Personally. Described exactly what she needed, mature, experienced, excellent references, someone who understood the importance of privacy. The agency had been thrilled to accommodate Madame Choi. They'd sent 3 candidates. Soo-jin had chosen Lee Hae-won after a 30-minute interview. Mid-40s. Quiet. Competent. The kind of woman who faded into wallpaper until you needed something, and then materialized with exactly what you'd requested before you finished asking. Send her to Min Seo, Soo-jin had instructed. Make sure she has everything she needs. Emphasize that this arrangement comes with my personal recommendation. The agency had been confused but compliant. Madame Choi's recommendation meant premium fees and future referrals. They'd delivered Hae-won to Min Seo's apartment the following Monday with a gift basket and a note expressing Madame Choi's sincere wishes for a healthy, comfortable pregnancy. Min Seo had been touched. She'd called Taemin crying, overwhelmed by his wife's unexpected kindness. He'd been suspicious immediately. Soo-jin didn't do kindness without calculation, but what could he say? Rejecting the help would insult everyone involved and confirm the pregnancy publicly. So Hae-won stayed. Cooked. Cleaned. Smiled. Took notes nobody saw. And waited. My professional reputation took its first hit in November. A shipment I'd approved 3 weeks earlier was flagged at customs, contamination in 2 containers, enough to trigger a full investigation of my audit process. The contamination was subtle. The kind of thing that could happen through negligence or deliberate sabotage, depending on who was telling the story. Internal Affairs interviewed me for 6 hours. Reviewed every document I'd signed. Questioned my methodology, my attention to detail, my commitment to accuracy. The lead investigator, a Korean man in his 50s who'd spent his entire career protecting the Kong family's legitimate operations, kept circling back to one question: did anyone pressure you to approve this shipment faster than protocol allowed? No. Did you receive any incentives to overlook potential issues? No. Then how do you explain the contamination? I couldn't. The audit trail was perfect. My documentation was thorough. But somewhere between my approval and the shipment leaving the warehouse, something had changed. Someone had changed it. They suspended me pending further investigation. Taemin didn't intervene. Didn't defend me. Didn't acknowledge my existence in the carefully worded statement his lawyers released about maintaining the highest standards of operational integrity. I'd sat in my apartment that night, staring at my phone, waiting for him to call. He didn't. For the first time since taking this job, I felt what I should have felt from the beginning, alone, expendable, a foreign black woman who'd convinced herself that competence would protect her in a world where loyalty mattered more than truth. Jinho had visited the next day. Not officially. Just showed up at my door with coffee and the uncomfortable expression of someone delivering bad news they didn't fully understand. Taemin can't be seen supporting you right now, he'd said. The investigation has political implications. If he intervenes, it looks like he's protecting criminal negligence. I wasn't negligent. I know. He knows. But perception matters more than truth in situations like this. Jinho had set down the coffee. He asked me to tell you, stay quiet. Don't defend yourself publicly. Let the investigation run its course. And if they decide I'm guilty? Then you're guilty, and he can't save you without destroying everything. Jinho's voice had softened. I'm sorry, Mia. This is how power works. Sometimes the innocent pay the price for stability. I stared at him. Get out. He'd left. The coffee had gone cold. And I'd understood, finally, that I'd been stupid to think Kang Taemin saw me as anything more than useful. 3 months passed. November bled into December, then January. My suspension continued. Terrence's treatment continued. My savings evaporated. I survived on the severance payment Taemin's lawyers had structured, generous enough to cover necessities, small enough to remind me that I was no longer employed, just managed. I didn't know that during those same 3 months, Lee Hae-won was settling into Minaseo's apartment with the patient competence of someone who'd done this before. She cooked Korean comfort food, mild, easy to digest, exactly what pregnant women craved. She cleaned without disrupting Minaseo's routines. She listened to complaints about morning sickness and swollen ankles with the perfect balance of sympathy and practicality. Minaseo trusted her completely. Why wouldn't she? Hae-won came recommended by Madame Choi herself. She was professional, discreet, and seemed genuinely invested in Minaseo's well-being. The poisoning was so gradual that Minaseo didn't notice. Small amounts of compounds that mimicked pregnancy symptoms, nausea, fatigue, dizziness. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would trigger immediate medical intervention. Just enough to weaken, to stress, to create the conditions where a body already working hard to sustain new life might decide the burden was too much. Hae-won documented everything. What Minaseo ate. When she felt sick. How often she rested. She took photographs of meals before serving them. Keep a detailed journal of daily activities. Built a record that would show nothing but dedicated, professional care if anyone ever questioned what happened next. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, which Hae-won would later claim was purely coincidental, Minaseo woke up bleeding. Not heavily at first. Just spotting. The kind of thing that can happen in early pregnancy, scary but not necessarily catastrophic. Hae-won had called the ambulance. Stayed calm. Accompanied Minaseo to the hospital. Held her hand while doctors examined her and delivered the news that her body was rejecting the pregnancy, that sometimes these things happened for no identifiable reason, that she was young and healthy and could try again. Minaseo had screamed. Then sobbed. Then gone silent in the way of grief too large for sound. Hae-won stayed with her through the procedure. Through the recovery. Through the empty return to an apartment that still smelled like the meals she'd prepared and the future that was no longer coming. And then, quietly, Hae-won had resigned. Cited personal reasons. Accepted 2 months additional salary as a thank you for her service. Disappeared back into whatever agency had sent her, leaving behind only excellent references and a pregnant woman who was pregnant no longer. Taemin found out 3 hours after the miscarriage. Not from Minaseo, she was sedated, unreachable. Not from Hae-won, she'd already left the hospital. From a security report that flagged Minaseo's emergency admission and cross-referenced it with his private calendar of people whose medical events required immediate notification. He'd arrived at the hospital in full operational mode, cold, controlled, surrounded by men whose job was managing disasters before they became scandals. Minaseo was still unconscious. The doctors were apologetic, thorough, and ultimately useless. Sometimes pregnancies fail. No clear cause. Nothing anyone could have done differently. Taemin had stood in that hospital room for 17 minutes. Just stood there, looking at a woman who'd been carrying his child 6 hours ago and was now empty, broken, A problem that couldn't be solved with money or violence or the careful application of power that had built his empire. Then he'd left. Didn't call his wife. Didn't summon his advisors. Didn't even tell Jinho where he was going. Just drove to the office, locked himself in, and sat in darkness until morning. Sujin had found out around the same time. Her sources were different but equally efficient. She'd been at a charity gala when the message arrived, a single text from a number she didn't recognize. It's done. She'd excused herself from the table. Found a private corridor. Read the message again. And then, witnesses would later disagree about whether they actually saw this or imagined it. She'd cried. Just for a moment. Just one tear that slid down her carefully made-up face before she wiped it away and returned to the gala like nothing had happened. Nobody questioned it. Madame Choi was known for her composure. If she'd seemed briefly emotional, it was probably the champagne or the moving speech about helping disadvantaged children that someone had just delivered. She'd stayed at the gala until midnight. Smiled through photographs. Made small talk with politicians' wives. Donated a sum that would be written up in society pages as extraordinarily generous. Then she'd gone home to the empty house she shared with a husband who was sitting in his office 40 minutes away, grieving a child he'd never told her about with a woman she'd known about for 8 months. She'd poured herself whiskey. Sat in her bedroom. And allowed herself exactly 30 minutes to feel whatever it was she felt, grief, guilt, satisfaction, horror, relief. Then she'd locked it away, showered, and gone to bed. The performance was perfect. The humanity was brief. And nobody watching would ever know which one was real. I noticed the pattern 3 weeks after Minasio's miscarriage, though I didn't know about the miscarriage yet. What I noticed was pharmaceutical inventory discrepancies, small amounts of compounds going missing from warehouses I'd previously audited, all of them substances that could induce complications in pregnancy if administered carefully over time. The amounts were negligible. The kind of thing that happens through spillage, measurement error, or employee theft for personal use. But the timing bothered me. All the discrepancies appeared in the same 3-month window. All from the same regional distribution center. All logged by the same quality control supervisor, a man who'd been flagged in my previous audits for being too precise, too thorough, exactly the kind of employee who didn't make mistakes. I'd been sitting in my apartment, suspended and officially unemployed, reviewing old audit files because I had nothing better to do and too much anxiety to sit still. The pattern materialized slowly, like an image developing in darkroom chemicals. Then all at once, it was obvious. Someone had been systematically accessing compounds that could cause pregnancy complications. Someone with authorization, knowledge, and opportunity. Someone who knew exactly how much to take to avoid triggering automated inventory alerts. I made a spreadsheet. Cross-referenced dates. Mapped the timeline. And realized with cold certainty that whoever did this had started preparations 4 months before Minasio's miscarriage, around the same time Sujin would have learned about the pregnancy. I didn't have proof. Didn't have access to personnel files or security footage or any of the resources I'd need to build a case. What I had was pattern recognition and the uncomfortable knowledge that if I was right, I was holding evidence of premeditated violence disguised as medical tragedy. I stared at my laptop screen for 20 minutes. Then I'd call the one person who could actually investigate this properly. Jinho answered on the 4th ring. Nia. This isn't a good time. When is it ever? I'd taken a breath. I need to show you something. It's about inventory discrepancies that might be connected to. Stop. Not on the phone. His voice had gone sharp. Where are you? Home. Stay there. I'm coming. He'd arrived 40 minutes later with 2 other men I'd never seen before. Security, but not the kind who stood outside offices. The kind who cleaned up problems that couldn't be solved legally. I'd shown them the spreadsheet. Walked them through the timeline. Watching their faces go carefully neutral in the way of people who understood exactly what I was showing them and didn't want to acknowledge it yet. This is speculative, one of them had said finally. It's a pattern. Patterns aren't proof. No. But they're enough to ask questions. I'd looked at Jinho directly. Someone used Kong family resources to poison a pregnant woman. Someone with access, knowledge, and motive. You know who fits that description. Jinho's expression was unreadable. What do you want me to do with this? Investigate it. Properly. Before someone else notices and starts asking why nobody did. He'd taken the laptop. Promised to look into it. Left without saying whether he believed me or thought I was trying to manufacture relevance after my suspension. I'd watched them go and understood that I'd just made myself dangerous in a new way, not as someone who could be discredited, but as someone who saw things people needed to stay hidden. Taemin summoned me 4 days later. Not a request. A summons delivered by text message at 6 in the morning, my office. 9 a.m. Come alone. I'd dressed carefully, professional, neutral, nothing that could be interpreted as defiance or submission. Walked into Kong Tower at exactly 9. Been escorted to the executive floor by security who looked at me like I was evidence being transported to trial. Taemin had been standing at his window when I entered, looking out over Seoul's skyline with his back to the door. He didn't turn around. Jinho showed me your research, he said quietly. And you've identified a problem I can't solve cleanly. He turned then, and I'd seen something in his face I'd never seen before, exhaustion. Not physical. The kind that comes from carrying too many secrets for too long. You're accusing my wife of murdering my unborn child. Do you understand what that means? I'm not accusing anyone. I'm showing you a pattern that needs investigation. Don't play semantic games with me, Nia. You know exactly what you're saying. His voice had gone cold. You're telling me that Soo Jin discovered the affair, discovered the pregnancy, and arranged for a miscarriage using resources I provided. You're telling me I'm responsible. I'm telling you someone used your pharmaceutical network to poison a pregnant woman, and the timeline suggests premeditation. I'd held his gaze. What you do with that information is your decision. But if you ignore it and it happens again, you won't be able to claim ignorance. If I investigate this, I will destroy my marriage and possibly trigger a war with Soo Jin's family. If I don't investigate, I'm complicit in murder. He'd moved closer, and I'd seen genuine anger there for the first time since I'd known him. You're asking me to choose between my empire and my conscience. That's not a choice. That's a confession that I never had a conscience to begin with. Then don't investigate, I'd said simply. Fire me. Discredit my findings. Bury this the way you bury everything else that threatens your power. Is that what you think I am? Someone who murders children to maintain status? I think you're someone who's spent so long protecting an empire that you've forgotten what you were protecting it for. My voice had hardened. And I think if you don't act on this, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if the next body is your responsibility too. He'd stared at me for a long moment. Then he'd picked up his phone, made a call in Korean too rapid for me to follow, and said something that made whoever answered go silent. When he'd hung up, he'd looked at me with something almost like respect. I'm reopening your suspension investigation. You'll be cleared within 48 hours. Return to work Monday. That's not. I'm not finished. His voice had cut through mine like wire. You'll report directly to me. No intermediaries. No one else sees your audits until I do. And Mia? He'd waited until I met his eyes. If you're wrong about this, if you've manufactured evidence to regain your position, I will end you so thoroughly you'll wish you'd never heard my name. And if I'm right? Then we'll both wish for the same thing. My reinstatement was announced with minimal fanfare. One internal memo. No apology. No explanation for why the investigation that was supposed to take months had concluded in days. I'd returned to my office to find everything exactly as I'd left it, which meant someone had been maintaining it, waiting for either my return or my permanent removal. The first threat arrived 3 days later. Not physical violence. That would have been too obvious. Instead, someone leaked my personal information to a conspiracy forum that specialized in targeting foreigners in sensitive positions. Within hours, my address, phone number, and daily routine were being discussed by people who believed I was part of some elaborate plot to undermine Korean sovereignty. The harassment started immediately. Phone calls at all hours. Messages describing exactly how I should be punished for crimes I hadn't committed. A package delivered to my apartment containing photographs of me taken at various locations around Seoul with red X's marked over my face. Security upgraded my protection. I got a new phone number. Moved to a different apartment in a building with actual security screening. But the damage was done. I'd been marked publicly as someone controversial, dangerous, worth targeting. Jinho had visited to explain what they'd found. The investigation into inventory discrepancies had dead-ended. All the compounds I'd identified could be explained through routine variants. The quality control supervisor had alibis for relevant dates. Security footage showed nothing suspicious. Either you're wrong, Jin Ho had said carefully, or whoever did this was professional enough to cover their tracks completely. Or you're not looking hard enough because you know what you'll find. He hadn't argued. Just left me with new security protocols and the understanding that I was being protected from consequences of questions I shouldn't have asked. The attacks escalated. Someone vandalized my car. Someone else filed a complaint claiming I'd assaulted them, easily disproven but time-consuming and publicly humiliating. A news blog ran a story about foreign workers abusing access to Korean corporate resources that didn't name me but described my situation with enough detail that anyone paying attention could identify me. I was being systematically isolated. Made radioactive. Turned into someone whose word couldn't be trusted because my credibility had been destroyed before I could speak. And through it all, Taemin watched from a distance, protected me just enough to keep me alive but not enough to make me safe, because safety would require him to admit what we both knew and neither of us could prove. The public incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Myeongdong, Seoul's busiest shopping district. I'd been reviewing inventory at a warehouse nearby, taking my lunch break at a cafe crowded with tourists and office workers. Normal. Anonymous. Safe. The man who approached me was young, mid-20s, Korean, well-dressed enough to blend with the business crowd. He walked directly to my table, set down a phone, and showed me a video playing without sound, footage of me entering Kong Tower, time-stamped, edited to look like I was sneaking in rather than arriving for legitimate work. Leave Korea, he'd said quietly in English. Or the next video shows your brother's hospital. His room number. His medication schedule. I watched the video. Then at him. Then very deliberately, I picked up my coffee and poured it over the phone. He jerked back, startled. That's when I'd moved, grabbed his wrist with one hand, twisted just enough to control without breaking, and used my other hand to remove the second phone he'd been recording with from his jacket pocket. Smile, I'd said, holding both phones up. You're about to be very famous. Security cameras throughout Myeongdong had captured everything. A black woman defending herself against a man who'd threatened her publicly, calmly, without escalating to violence. Within hours, the footage was circulating on Korean social media, not as evidence of foreign aggression but as proof that whoever was targeting me was doing it publicly enough to be filmed. The narrative shifted. Not completely. Not cleanly. But enough that questions started being asked. Why was a foreign quality control auditor being harassed? What had she discovered that made her dangerous? Who benefited from her silence? Taemin's security had extracted me from the cafe within minutes. Taken me directly to his office. He'd watched the footage 3 times without speaking. You just made yourself a public figure, he'd said finally. You understand that means you can't disappear quietly anymore? Good. It also means whoever's targeting you has to escalate or retreat. They're not going to retreat. Then let them escalate. At least now there are witnesses. He'd studied me with that calculating look I'd learned to recognize as respect. You're either very brave or very stupid. I'm very tired of being afraid. I'd met his eyes. And I'm done pretending that staying quiet protects anyone but the people who want me silenced. Something had shifted in his expression. Jinho's loyalty is to me. But his men's loyalty can be bought. Someone inside my organization is feeding information to whoever's orchestrating this. You're just realizing that now? I'm admitting it now. There's a difference. He'd pulled up files on his computer. I'm giving you access to personnel records. Security logs. Everything you'd need to identify who's been tracking you. Find them. Why trust me with this? Because you've proven you can't be bought or scared into silence. His voice had gone quiet. And because if I don't root out the betrayal now, it won't stop with you. I'd found the leak in 4 days. Not through sophisticated analysis or dramatic confrontation, just by mapping who had access to my schedule, cross-referencing with who'd been present when information about me became public, and following the pattern of small inconsistencies that add up to proof when nobody's paying attention to the details. The name was Park Dong-min. Not one of Taemin's primary lieutenants. Not security or personal staff. Just a mid-level operations coordinator who'd worked for the Kong family for 8 years, trusted enough to handle sensitive logistics but not important enough to attract scrutiny. He'd been feeding information to an intermediary who reported to someone I couldn't identify, payments made through cryptocurrency, communications through encrypted apps, all of it structured to ensure nobody could trace the chain back to its source. But I had enough. Dates. Times. Communications that lined up perfectly with every attack, every leaked detail, every moment when someone knew exactly where I'd be and when. I'd taken everything to Taemin, watched him review the evidence with the cold precision of someone who'd built an empire by knowing when to trust and when to eliminate. When he'd finished reading, he'd made 2 phone calls in Korean. The first resulted in Dongmin being brought to Kong Tower under the pretense of a routine meeting. The second resulted in Jinho arriving with 3 men whose job was extracting truth from people who'd built careers on lying. Dongmin had confessed within an hour. Not dramatically. Not after torture. Just after being shown the evidence and given a choice, explain everything and accept prison, or stay silent and accept what came next. He'd explained everything. The payments had started 6 months ago. The contact had approached him through an intermediary, offered money for information about a foreign employee's schedule and activities. Nothing violent. Nothing illegal. Just information. Dongmin hadn't known why someone wanted the information, hadn't asked, and hadn't cared as long as the money kept coming. Who hired you? Taemin had asked. I don't know. I was never given a name. Who did you report to? A phone number. That's all. It changes every 2 weeks. Guess. Dongmin had looked at the floor. Then at Taemin. Then at me. And very quietly, he'd said, someone who knew exactly what to ask for. Someone who understood your organization well enough to know what information mattered. Someone inside your household. The room had gone silent. Taemin's face had remained perfectly calm. But I'd seen his hand tighten on the desk edge, just slightly, just enough to make his knuckles go white. Thank you for your honesty, Taemin had said softly. Jinho will make sure you're comfortable until the police arrive. After Dongmin had been escorted out, Taemin had looked at me. It's Soo-jin. You know that. I suspected. She knew about the pregnancy. Arranged for the miscarriage. And then made sure you discovered enough to make it your problem instead of hers. His voice had been flat, devoid of emotion. She turned you into a weapon pointed at me. What are you going to do? Nothing. Yet. He'd stood, moved to the window. If I confront her without absolute proof, she'll deny everything. Her family is powerful enough to make accusations that destroy me. I need certainty. You have certainty. You just don't want to admit what it costs. He turned to look at me. And what does it cost? Everything you've built. Your marriage. Your alliances. Your empire. I'd stepped closer. But mostly, it cost you the ability to pretend you didn't know. And that's the one thing you can't afford to lose. Soo-jin had requested a meeting 2 days later. Not with Taemin. With me. The message had come through proper channels, a formal invitation to tea at their private residence, delivered with the kind of gracious politeness that made refusal impossible without causing insult. I'd arrived exactly on time. Been shown to a sitting room that probably cost more than my entire year's salary to furnish. Soo-jin had been waiting, perfectly composed, tea already poured. Miss Cole, she'd said in flawless English. Thank you for coming. I know we haven't had many opportunities to speak directly. No, we haven't. I wanted to correct that. You've become quite important to my husband's operations. It seems appropriate that we understand each other. She gestured to the chair across from her. Please, sit. I sat. Accepting the tea I had no intention of drinking. I've heard about the unfortunate harassment you've experienced, Soo-jin had continued. It must be frightening, being targeted so publicly. It's been educational. I'm sure. Her smile hadn't reached her eyes. But I wanted you to know, whatever concerns arose during your suspension have been fully resolved. My husband trusts your work completely. As do I. Is that what this meeting is about? Reassurance? Partially. She'd set down her cup with delicate precision. But also clarity. You're a very intelligent woman, Miss Cole. I suspect you've drawn certain conclusions about recent events. I wanted to ensure those conclusions don't become complicated. Meaning? Meaning that marriages require discretion. Betrayals require discretion. And sometimes, justice requires discretion as well. Her voice had remained perfectly pleasant. My husband made a mistake. That mistake has been corrected. The correction required resources and planning that you've unfortunately become aware of. But awareness doesn't require action. I stared at her. You're admitting you arranged the miscarriage. I'm admitting nothing. I'm simply explaining that some women protect their marriages by screaming. Others do it by acting. I chose action. And I chose it knowing exactly what it would cost and whom it would hurt. She'd leaned forward slightly. The question is, what will you choose? Justice. Justice for whom? A mistress who knew exactly what she was doing when she accepted my husband's attention? A child who would have destroyed multiple families by existing? Sujin's composure had cracked just slightly. Or justice for yourself, Miss Cole? You've been harassed. Isolated. Threatened. All of that stops the moment you decide that some battles aren't yours to fight. And if I don't decide that? Then you'll discover that being right doesn't protect you. Being foreign doesn't protect you. And being morally superior certainly doesn't protect you. Her voice had gone cold. I've been patient. I've been gracious. But patience has limits. And you've just reached mine. I stood up. Thank you for the tea, Madam Choi. This conversation has been very clarifying. Has it? Yes. It's clarified that you're not as smart as you think you are. I walked toward the door, then turned back. You've admitted to murder, justified it as marriage protection, and threatened me in your own home. All while security cameras recorded everything. So yes. Very clarifying. Her face had gone white. You're bluffing. Check the room carefully when I leave. Then ask yourself if I'm the kind of person who walks into danger without evidence. I'd left before she could respond. Made it to my car before my hands started shaking. I hadn't actually recorded anything, she'd been too careful about security for that to work. But the bluff had accomplished what I needed, absolute certainty that Sujin was guilty and absolute certainty that she knew I knew. Now the only question was whether Taemin would actually do something about it. I'd confronted Taemin that same evening. Didn't schedule a meeting. Didn't wait for appropriate timing. Just walked into Kong Tower, past security who'd learned not to stop me, and entered his office without knocking. He'd been in a meeting with 3 men I didn't recognize. All of them had looked up, startled. I'd ignored them completely. I need everyone to leave, I'd said calmly. Now. Taemin had studied me for 3 seconds. Then nodded once. The men had filed out without a word. When we were alone, I closed the door. Your wife just confessed to arranging Minasio's miscarriage. She admitted using your pharmaceutical resources to poison a pregnant woman. And she threatened me to keep it quiet. I know. You know? I've known since before you presented the evidence. I just needed her to confirm it directly. He gestured to his computer. My residence has been under audio surveillance for 3 months. Every conversation. Every phone call. Including the one you just had with Sujin. I stared at him. You've been recording your own wife? I've been documenting evidence for when this inevitably became public. His voice had carried no emotion. Which it will. Tomorrow morning. I'm filing for divorce and requesting a criminal investigation into the miscarriage. The scandal will be total. Permanent. Exactly what Sujin was trying to avoid. And your empire? Will fracture. Sujin's family will retaliate. Half my allies will choose sides. The other half will use the chaos to grab territory. He'd met my eyes. But at least it will fracture on truth instead of pretending to stand on lies. I'd moved closer to his desk. You're destroying everything you built. No. I'm destroying what I built on something rotten and hoping something better can grow in its place. He'd picked up a folder, handed it to me. This is evidence transfer documentation. Everything about the miscarriage, the inventory discrepancies, Sujin's planning. I'm giving it to you because you're the only person I trust not to use it for leverage. Why me? Because you never wanted power over me. You just wanted the truth. His voice had softened slightly. And because if I'm going to burn my life down, I'd prefer it be for someone who actually deserves the sacrifice. I opened the folder. Seeing documentation so thorough it would end careers, destroy reputations, trigger investigations that would last years. If I take this public, you'll be prosecuted too. You provided the infrastructure she used. I know. You'll lose everything. I know that too. He'd stood, walked to the window that looked out over the city he'd controlled for 17 years. But Nia, I've spent so long protecting everything that I forgot what any of it was for. And then you walked into my tea lounge, corrected a negotiation, and showed me what integrity actually looks like when it costs something real. This is insane. This is necessary. He'd turned to face me. So take the evidence. Do what you came to Korea to do. Be the person your mother raised. And let me figure out who I am when I'm not pretending to be powerful. I'd stood there holding documentation that would destroy multiple lives and understood that this was the moral test I'd been avoiding since the day I took this job, not whether to do the right thing when it was easy, but whether to do it when it would hurt everyone, including people I'd come to respect. I'm not your pawn, I'd said finally. I know. And I'm not your redemption either. I know that too. But I will take this evidence. And I will use it. And when everything falls apart, don't expect me to rebuild your empire or your conscience. I'd moved toward the door. You made your choices. Now live with them. Nia. His voice had stopped me at the threshold. Thank you. For not letting me stay comfortable. I'd left without answering. Because some statements don't deserve comfort. They just deserve silence. The timeline converged 3 days later. I'd delivered the evidence to prosecutors Friday morning. Filed formal statements. Provided documentation that built a case so thorough it couldn't be dismissed or delayed. By Saturday afternoon, news outlets were reporting on an investigation into allegations of poisoning connected to a prominent Seoul family. By Sunday morning, Taemin was in the hospital. The symptoms had started Saturday night: chest pain, difficulty breathing, the kind of distress that could be cardiac or could be something introduced into his system by someone with access and motivation. Security had called an ambulance. Jinho had sealed the executive floor. And I'd gotten a message at 3 in the morning: he's asking for you. I'd driven to Seoul National University Hospital expecting to find him weak, vulnerable, and finally human. Instead, I'd found him surrounded by machines and medical staff, fully conscious, and absolutely furious. Someone poisoned me, he'd said the moment I entered. The same compounds from the warehouse discrepancies. Administered within the last 12 hours. Sujin? Unknown. She has an alibi, she was at her sister's house when this happened. But alibis can be arranged. Especially when you're desperate to stop an investigation before it destroys your entire family. Doctors had pushed me aside then, shouting about cardiac monitors and calling for crash carts. That's when time had compressed into the crystalline moment of crisis, 30 seconds on the clock, everyone moving too fast, and me standing there knowing exactly what was happening because I'd seen this pattern before in audit reports I'd filed months ago. Stop, I'd said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear enough to cut through panic. You're going to kill him if you treat this like cardiac arrest. Check for anticoagulant poisoning. He's bleeding internally, not having a heart attack. The lead doctor had frozen. How do you? Because I audited the facility that stores exactly the compounds that would cause these symptoms. And I know that cardiac protocols will accelerate the hemorrhaging instead of stopping it. They'd run tests. Confirmed anticoagulant poisoning. Stabilized Taemin within minutes instead of losing him to the treatment that would have killed him faster than the poison. And through it all, cameras had been recording. Security footage. Medical staff phones. Journalists who'd been camped outside since news of the investigation broke. All of them capture the moment when a black foreign auditor saved the life of a Korean mafia boss by recognizing poison that his own medical team had missed. The footage went viral within hours. Not as scandalous. As vindication. Proof that I'd been right about the pharmaceutical discrepancies. Proof that someone was still trying to silence the investigation. Proof that the woman who'd been harassed, discredited, and threatened had just saved the life of the man whose empire was collapsing because she'd insisted on the truth. Public opinion shifted completely. Suddenly I wasn't a foreign troublemaker. I was a whistleblower who'd survived retaliation. The investigation accelerated. And everyone started asking the same question: if Soo Jin would poison her husband to stop exposure, what else had she done? The investigation moved with the kind of speed that only happens when public attention makes delay politically impossible. Prosecutors subpoenaed pharmaceutical records, security footage, financial transactions. Everything I'd documented plus everything law enforcement resources could uncover. Soo Jin was arrested Tuesday morning. Not dramatically. Just quietly extracted from her sister's house, brought in for questioning, and held when her attorney's carefully prepared statements collapsed under the weight of documentation that proved premeditation, planning, and multiple attempts to obstruct justice. Lee Hae-won, the housekeeper, was arrested the same day. She'd been located in Busan, working under a different name for a different family. When presented with evidence of the compounds she'd administered to Min Seo, she'd confessed immediately, not to murder, just to following instructions from an employer who'd paid her well for tasks she hadn't fully understood. The confession was calculated, strategic, designed to position herself as a tool rather than a conspirator. But it was enough to connect Soo Jin directly to the miscarriage. Park Dong-min, the insider who leaked my information, turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced charges. Provided communications, financial records, a complete timeline of how Soo Jin had orchestrated harassment designed to discredit me before I could expose what she'd done. And through it all, I'd sat in prosecutors' offices, answering questions, providing context, watching justice move with the clinical precision I'd spent my entire career trying to maintain in systems that preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truth. Tae-min had recovered. Been released from the hospital with security that made presidential protection look casual. He'd stepped down as head of the Kong family immediately, not because prosecutors demanded it, but because he'd announced it publicly before anyone could force the decision. His empire did fracture. Exactly as he'd predicted. Allies chose sides. Territory disputes erupted. The carefully balanced structure he'd maintained for 17 years collapsed into chaos as everyone tried to grab what they could before someone else did. But the collapse was clean. No bodies. No revenge killings. Just the systematic dismantling of an organization that had been held together by one man's willingness to pretend his foundation wasn't built on compromises that eventually required murder to sustain. Min Seo testified via video conference. Described the care Hae-won had provided. The meals. The gradual illness that doctors couldn't explain. The miscarriage that had seemed like a tragic chance until audit trails revealed deliberate sabotage. Her testimony was devastating. Clinical. Precise. And absolutely damning. Soo Jin's trial became the kind of spectacle that normally only happens to politicians or celebrities: daily coverage, expert analysis, public opinion polls about whether poisoning a mistress to protect a marriage constituted justifiable response or premeditated murder. The prosecution built its case on documentation I'd provided. Showed the planning. The timing. The use of Kong family resources for personal revenge disguised as household management. Demonstrated that Soo Jin had known exactly what she was doing, had researched compounds and dosages, had specifically chosen someone vulnerable enough to target and powerful enough to hurt Tae-min by proxy. The defense tried every strategy. Claimed she'd been protecting her marriage from a predatory mistress. Argued that the miscarriage couldn't be definitively linked to poisoning. Suggested that I'd fabricated evidence to gain revenge for my suspension. Portrayed Soo Jin as a victim of her husband's infidelity who'd made desperate choices under emotional duress. None of it worked. The evidence was too thorough. The planning is too obvious. The subsequent poisoning of Tae-min too clearly connected to the investigation's progress. The verdict came after 3 weeks of trial, guilty on multiple counts including assault, poisoning, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and attempted murder. The sentence came 2 days later, 12 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 8. Soo Jin had stood perfectly composed as the judge read the sentence. Didn't cry. Didn't protest. Just maintained the dignified silence that had characterized her entire public life. But as they'd led her out of the courtroom, she'd looked directly at me. Not with hatred. Not with regret. Just with the cold assessment of someone acknowledging an equal who'd played the game better. I'd met her eyes and nodded once. Respect without sympathy. Recognition without reconciliation. Outside the courthouse, the press had swarmed. Cameras. Questions. The kind of attention I'd spent 6 months trying to avoid and now couldn't escape. How does it feel to bring down one of Seoul's most powerful families? Someone shouted. I'd stopped. Looked at the cameras. I didn't bring down anything. I just refused to let people die quietly while everyone pretended not to notice. Then I'd walked away before anyone could ask follow-up questions that required me to perform righteousness I didn't feel. Taemin had requested a meeting 1 week after Sujin's sentencing. Not at Kong Tower, he no longer controlled that building. Not at his residence, it had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution. At the same hotel tea lounge where we'd first met, 8 months and a lifetime ago. He looked different. Not older. Just smaller somehow. Like stepping away from power had revealed how much of him had been performance. Thank you for coming, he'd said. You didn't give me much choice. You always had a choice. That's what made you dangerous. He poured tea with the same economical movements I remembered. I'm leaving Seoul. Possibly leaving Korea. Starting something new somewhere nobody knows my name. Running away? Relocating strategically. Almost a smile. I've been offered legitimate business opportunities in Hong Kong. Consulting work. Nothing criminal. Nothing that requires maintaining an empire through violence and compromise. You'll be bored within 6 months. Probably. But boredom feels preferable to whatever I was becoming. He'd set down the teapot. I wanted to apologize. For using you. For not protecting you sooner. For putting you in a position where doing the right thing nearly got you killed. I put myself in that position. Nobody forced me to take your job or investigate discrepancies or confront your wife. No. But I created the conditions that made all of it necessary. His voice had been quiet. You came to Korea to work in quality control. You ended up dismantling an empire because I was too cowardly to dismantle it myself. So what now? You apologize and we pretend that makes it balanced? No. I apologize and we acknowledge that some damage can't be repaired, only survived. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is documentation transferring ownership of several properties to you. Not as payment. As recognition that you lost your career, your privacy, and any chance of a quiet life because you refused to look away when everyone else did. I'd stared at the envelope. I don't want your property. Then sell them and donate the money. Use them as collateral for whatever comes next. I don't care. He'd pushed it across the table. But take them. Because you earned them by being better than everyone in my world, including me. I'd taken the envelope. Not because I wanted what it contained, but because refusing felt like performing integrity I hadn't actually maintained consistently enough to deserve. Are you going to be okay? I'd asked. Eventually. Are you? I don't know yet. Honest answer. Maybe the only one that mattered. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he'd stood, bowed formally, the kind of bow that acknowledged equals, not power dynamics, and left. I'd watched him walk away and understood that this was the cleanest ending I'd get. No reconciliation. No friendship. Just mutual recognition between two people who'd damaged each other while trying to do something that approximated right. Life after the trial was strange. I'd been offered my job back at Kong Tower, now under new management that wanted to demonstrate commitment to ethical operations. I'd declined. Accepted a consulting position with Korea's pharmaceutical regulatory agency instead. Better pay. More autonomy. Work that actually served public good instead of private empire. Terrence had completed his treatment successfully. He'd returned to the States. I stayed in Korea. Not because I loved it here, I wasn't sure I'd ever fully belong, but because leaving felt like admitting defeat to everyone who'd tried to drive me away. Minicio had started a foundation for women who'd experienced pregnancy loss through violence or medical negligence. I'd donated anonymously. Didn't want recognition. I just wanted something good to come from something that had been purely destructive. The harassment stopped completely. Not because people suddenly respected me, but because attacking a public whistleblower who'd been vindicated carried more risk than reward. I'd become protected by visibility rather than power, which felt unstable but functional. I'd been organizing my new office when Jinho visited. He'd left the Kong organization after Taemin's departure. Started private security consulting. We'd maintained awkward contact. There's something you should see, he'd said, setting down a tablet that showed financial records I recognized from my audits. What am I looking at? Secondary accounts connected to the pharmaceutical discrepancies. We thought we'd found everything, but these were hidden in a completely separate system. He'd scrolled through transactions. Someone else was involved. Not Sujin. Not Dongmin, someone we haven't identified yet. I'd studied the records. Seen patterns that looked familiar but couldn't place exactly why. Who has access to these accounts? That's the problem. The access is anonymous. Routed through multiple jurisdictions. Professional enough that it might be corporate espionage or might be something else entirely. Jinho had looked at me directly. I think whoever did this is still active. Still operating. And now that Sujin's in prison and Taemin's gone, they might escalate. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only person who saw the pattern before. And because if there's another threat building, I'd rather you know about it than be blindsided. He'd closed the tablet. Consider it professional courtesy. Or an apology. Or whatever makes you feel better about accepting information from someone who didn't protect you when I should have. I took the tablet. I'll look at it. But Jinho? If this turns into another investigation that nearly gets me killed, I'm holding you personally responsible. Fair enough. He'd left. And I'd sat there staring at financial records that suggested the story wasn't actually over, just waiting for its next chapter. 6 months later, I'd built something that looked like stability. My regulatory work was challenging and mostly corruption-free. I'd started teaching workshops on audit methodology for international employees navigating Korean corporate culture. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of work that wouldn't make headlines but might prevent the next disaster. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Plain envelope. Sole postmark. No return address. Inside, a single page typed in English. You exposed 1 threat. 3 remain. The pharmaceutical discrepancies weren't isolated. They were preparing. Someone is building infrastructure for something larger. The compound Sujin used? They're still being diverted. Different facilities. Different administrators. Same pattern. You're the only person who would recognize what I'm showing you because you're the only person who looked closely enough the first time. Attached is documentation you'll need. Use it carefully. Trust selectively. And Nia, watch your back. The people who wanted you silenced haven't forgotten you exist. Below the text, encrypted access codes to files I'd need specialized software to open. I stared at the letter for 5 full minutes. Then I called Jinho. Did you send me an anonymous warning about pharmaceutical discrepancies? No. Why? Because someone just sent me documentation suggesting that what we uncovered with Sujin was preparation for something bigger. I'd read him the letter. Any idea who this is? Silence. Then, that sounds like information only someone inside the regulatory system would have. Or someone still inside the Kong organization. The Kong organization doesn't exist anymore. It's been fragmented into 6 different operations, none of which have centralized intelligence. So we're back to being a regulatory insider. I'd pulled up the encrypted files. Started working on access. Which means whoever sent this either wants my help or wants to set me up. Or both. Comforting thought. I'd spent the next week analyzing the documentation. Cross-referencing with my previous audits. Mapping patterns that looked disturbingly similar to what I'd seen before Sujin's arrest. Different facilities. Different personnel. But the same careful, systematic approach to diverting compounds in quantities too small to trigger automated alerts. Whoever was doing this had learned from Sujin's mistakes. Made their operation more distributed. More professional. More patient. And they were building towards something I couldn't identify yet but recognized as dangerous. I'd been standing in my apartment 3 months after receiving that letter, surrounded by documents and trying to map connections that kept dissolving into uncertainty, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I'd almost ignored it. Nia Cole? The voice was female. Korean. Familiar but I couldn't place it. Who is this? Someone who watched you dismantle an empire and wondered if you'd be brave enough to do it again. Pause. The documentation I sent, have you analyzed it? You're the anonymous source? I'm one of several people who've been monitoring the situation since Taemin stepped down. Some of us believe the system can be fixed. Others believe it needs to burn completely. Where do you stand? I stand for not poisoning pregnant women. Everything else is negotiable. Laughter. Good answer. We're going to send you more information. Names. Locations. Evidence that will make what you exposed with Sujin look small. But Nia, this time, you can't trust the regulatory agencies. The corruption goes higher than you think. Then who do I trust? Yourself. And maybe the people who've been protecting you without you knowing it. The voice had softened slightly. Power doesn't always shout, Nia. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it builds infrastructure that takes years to understand but seconds to deploy. The call ended. No explanation. No follow-up. Just the knowledge that I'd been pulled into something larger than personal revenge or corporate corruption. I'd looked at the documents spread across my apartment. Saw patterns connecting pharmaceutical facilities, financial networks, political connections. Understood that what I'd thought was an ending had been a beginning. Outside my window, Seoul glittered with the kind of beauty that hid exactly how many secrets cities could hold. I'd come here to work in quality control. I'd stay to expose murder. And now I was looking at evidence suggesting that some wars don't end with trials and prison sentences. They evolve. They adapt. They wait for the next person brave enough or stupid enough to ask questions nobody wants answered. I'd picked up my phone. Started making calls. Not to prosecutors or police or anyone official. To the network of people I'd built during the investigation, regulatory workers who'd helped quietly, journalists who'd reported honestly, former Kong employees who'd chosen ethics over employment. Because if power whispered, then maybe justice needed to whisper back. Patiently. Strategically. Without the performance of righteousness but with the steady accumulation of truth that eventually became too heavy to ignore. My mother had raised me to believe that excellence would protect me. It hadn't. But it has given me tools to protect others. And maybe that was enough. The screen on my laptop showed satellite imagery of pharmaceutical facilities across Southeast Asia. Supply chains that connected Seoul to Bangkok to Manila. Financial networks that looked legitimate until you knew exactly what to look for. Someone was building something. And they'd made the mistake of assuming I'd stop after destroying one empire. I wouldn't. Because some patterns demanded recognition. Some threats demanded response. And some stories didn't end with verdicts and prison sentences. They just evolved into whatever came next. The camera on my laptop flickered. Just once. Barely noticeable. But I noticed everything now. Someone was watching. Someone always was. The question was whether they were protecting me or preparing to eliminate me when I got too close to whatever truth they were hiding. I'd closed the laptop. Sat in darkness. And smiled. Because if they were watching, it meant I'd already found something worth hiding. And that meant I knew exactly where to look next. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. But so do I.